Hi everyone, Joseph Koenskin here. Welcome back to my art studio. Today I want to show you how I paint an aspen tree in the painting I'm currently working on. There's a lot of details and many layers, but in the end, all that time and effort is going to be worth it because these trees look great in any painting. It's going to be perfect for the robin that I have perched on one of these branches. Now, I will show you how I paint the robin in an upcoming video, but for this video today, let's get into the details of this aspen tree. Alright, to start, the colors I'm going to be using are alizarin crimson, raw umber, Mars black, titanium white. And this is going to be the basis for all the color that's in the tree. Later on, I'm going to add some cadmium red light and some yellow oxide when I want to add a small amount of orange to some of the spots in the bark. So this gray color is mostly titanium white, tiny bit of the Mars black, really small amounts of the raw umber and alizarin crimson, just to give it a little bit of tone so it's not completely gray. So I've got my board. This is 12 by 16. I've got a light gray background, and I've got my outline for the robin and my outline for the tree, which kind of curves down on the left side of the painting here. And the first thing I'm going to do is just add some distant branches in the background, just to kind of give a little bit of a hint of some background trees that have their branches kind of coming into the frame. So I'm just using a round number 4 brush. And then I'm just going to start with my branch shape. I'm being very careful here because there's not going to be a lot of detail in these background branches. I want them to feel very distant. So getting the shape of these branches correct is going to be very important in the beginning to make them look real. And something about background branches that I want to look further away than the trunk in the foreground is to keep them light with not as much detail and to especially keep the contrast low. That's going to help push them into the distance and just give that feeling of separation between the background and the foreground. And I'm not going to fully detail these background branches just yet. I'm just going to block them in a little bit so I know where they're going to be and just the general shape. And then I'm going to paint the trunk first and then come back and finish off the details in these background branches later. I want to get a good sense of how light and dark I should make these, and it's kind of difficult to do that without the context of the tree trunk in the foreground. Now I can start blocking in the dark spots and lines and little cracks that are in the aspen tree that are so characteristic of these trees and what make them look really great in paintings. Really, these are going to be the things that give the tree the look and the shape as I try and follow the contour and that rounded shape of the tree trunk with these dark spots and dark lines. So I'm just painting very loosely. I don't want to get too detailed yet because I'm going to be covering some of this up and trying to soften certain edges. This is just really to get a sense of where everything is on this aspen tree. And this whole process is going to be quite long and a little bit tedious because the way I like to do this is to build everything up slowly in layers, just layer upon layer, alternating back and forth between light and dark, and you'll see that in the end, this is really going to create a nice effect, give it that nice rounded three-dimensional shape that it has. And all the details of these dark lines and spots and the branches in the background, I think are really going to look nice in this painting. And then there's this branch that kind of comes in front of the main tree trunk here. So I'm just going to paint that in. Hopefully this will be kind of a nice detail for the foreground. So now just onto the branch that the robin is going to be sitting on. And this branch is a dead branch, so it has like little bits of bark hanging off of it and some of the wood underneath exposed, and so it'll have this really great texture that we'll come to later in the painting. Now I'll just get the general shape of where some of this tree bark is and just some of the shadows that are on the branch. And already I just want to keep in mind the shadow that the robin is casting on this branch. I'll probably have to correct that later on, especially once the robin is painted, but for now I can kind of plan ahead with some of these shadows and where all the dark spots are going to be. And I am using a reference photo here for this tree that I took of some trees that are near where I live. And so I'm sort of constantly looking at my reference photo and back to the painting just to make sure that I get all these spots and lines looking where they need to be. You don't have to follow your reference photo exactly. It's just good to follow it close enough so that it looks real and looks nice and natural rather than trying to make up all these little lines and spots. I don't follow it 100% exact. I sometimes move certain things around or kind of change the shape of something, especially if I want it to look a certain way in the painting, or if I'm looking for a particular balance. You know, if a branch, sticks out too far in this direction or in that direction, or if I want the tree to be darker on one side and lighter on the other, then I can certainly do that. And then onto this bottom branch here, which has a very similar look to the top branch that the robin is going to be sitting on. Okay, I think that's looking really good. All the spots and stripes and marks are in kind of the right spot, and this is a good place to start from. In this painting, I have the light coming from the right side, so the shadow is going to be on the left side of the trunk. So I'm just going to start with one of the darker shadows that's on the tree trunk. The light on this is going to be fairly subtle in terms of the difference between the values of the shadow and the light, but I'm going to start here and just kind of build that shape around, starting from the dark and going into the light. I may come back later and do some adjustments, but I'll start here and see how it looks. So again, I'm just painting this very loosely, just trying to follow the general shape and paint around some of these spots. There is quite a bit of subtle structure in some of the lines and the shadows and the highlights in these parts, so I'm just trying to follow that reference photo so that it looks natural and looks real. And here I can start to kind of visualize just the way the light is going to fall on this tree, and even just with the small amount of shadow color, it's starting to have that round shape that I'm going for. Again, just going around all these spots and lines that I've already put down. And in a lot of these cases, these dark spots and dark lines and these cracks that are in the trunk have these light shadow lines and colors that extend out beyond those marks. Very subtle at times, but make a big difference to the tree looking real. So just continuing down, and this does take a bit of patience and quite a bit of time here because you're putting in all these details, and starting from the top of the tree trunk to the bottom, you're painting all these lines and going around all these little details, but each one of these little subtle lines and shadow marks is really going to add to the nice realism of this tree. And sometimes you can get away with painting a little bit more loosely with the background, like with trees or rocks and certain things like that, because it's not like an animal where the proportions have to be exactly perfect. You can kind of work quickly, and you can see I'm working really quickly here. And so there is a little bit of room to kind of play around with some of these shapes to make them look right, but generally I try and keep it mostly to what I'm seeing in my photos. And you can see that I am sometimes covering up some of these spots and lines, but that's okay because I'm going to come back and refine those edges later on when I start coming in with my darker colors to really bring out the contrast of these spots. Okay, I think that's a really good foundation for the first shadow color. It's already starting to have that nice shape, that nice direction of light. So now I can lighten this gray mixture and go up to the next layer, and I can start slowly softening these edges and building up that three-dimensional shape from dark to light. And now you can see I'm going a little bit slower here and just being a little bit more deliberate about where I put things, trying to follow those shapes and those shadows. Okay, so still with my round number 4 brush, and like I had said before, this is going to be a bit of a long process where it's very subtle colors starting from dark to light and going back and forth between highlight and shadow. And right now what I'm doing is just building a solid foundation for all the details of these little spots and lines and dark cracks that are so characteristic of these aspen trees. So as I build up these colors, these mid-range values, as I slowly build this shadow color into the highlight, it's going to look fairly flat and it's going to look very low contrast, but all that will change once we get into some of our darker colors. And one of the ways that I'm using the paint here is I'm using it in sort of a semi-transparent, semi-opaque way, where I'm allowing some of the white gesso from the board to come through the paint, or some of that darker color, and some of the paint I'm overlapping on top of previous paint so that it's a little bit more opaque. And this variation is going to build in a lot of randomness and a lot of that natural variation you see when you're looking at the bark on a real aspen tree. Nature often has a lot of color variation and a lot of subtle color changes, especially when you look up close. And using the paint in this way, overlapping, transparent, and opaque, really helps give it that nice natural randomness that you see on a real tree. So just continuing down, and I like this part at the bottom of the tree. When I was out taking pictures of trees for this reference, I was looking for something that had, a lot of character and a lot of these nice sort of dark marks and branches and just interesting shapes that would be fun to paint and would look really good in the painting. Okay, that's starting to look really good. It's got even more of that three-dimensional shape and that nice rounded look from dark to light. And now what I want to do is I want to just start refining some of the dark spots that are going to be on this tree. And I'm not going to go with my darkest color yet, because what I want to do is use this to clean up some of the edges of the places where I blocked in some of these first dark spots. This is also going to help as kind of the foundation for my darkest color when I really bring in that contrast later. And the reason I do this is because I don't want there to just be, in certain cases, a really hard, sharp line with some of the dark spots. I want to be able to build it up so that you have this nice gradient from dark to light, even in these very, very small, sharp, fine details. And even though this part, adding all these tiny little details, can be quite time consuming and sometimes a little bit tedious, it really is going to be worth it in the end, because all these little fine details and all these tiny little things that we're putting in here are going to really make this tree stand out. And it's that attention to detail that just adds so much realism to these backgrounds. I'm just going to darken the left edge of this trunk here just to give it a bit of a stronger shadow. And I will go back and make other adjustments like that just to make sure that the tree looks nice and natural, and especially because I want to have a fairly strong direction of light. And then I'll just continue on down the tree trunk, building on all that foundation that I added before. And in certain spots on these aspen trees, like you see here, there's this sort of line of dots and marks that go down, a certain part of the tree trunk, and I just really like that detail. And again, just adding a little bit of a darker shadow to that left edge just to give it a stronger sense of direction of light. And that's the great thing about something like this, is I can always go back and change things. If something needs to be lighter, something needs to be darker, it's good to just go back and change it and adjust it based on what you think the painting needs and what the composition of the painting needs. And now I'm detailing the branch. And I'm putting the paint on a little bit transparently. I want some of the colors to show through the other colors. This helps kind of add to some of the realism of these dead branches and the little bark that's hanging on. Because there's a lot of color variation, a lot of lines, a lot of spots, and if I find that some of the paint is transparent, it really gives this nice, realistic look. Now I can go in and start building up the highlight. This color is titanium white with a little bit of raw umber and a little bit of alizarin crimson, maybe a tiny bit of the Mars black just to darken it slightly, because this is not going to be the lightest color. I'm going to use titanium white for the lightest highlight just on the edge, but for here I just want to build up a highlight and just kind of get some of these top edges here on some of these ridges. I don't want to overdo it too much with the highlight color. I want to leave some of those mid-range values in the center of the trunk so that the highlights on some of these ridges really stand out. And these ridges will only get stronger once I come in with the final highlight after I lay down the first base of this first highlight color. So just continuing down on the right side of the tree trunk. And you can see I don't really have to add too much for this to be effective. All that foundation work we did before really helps when I start adding these final highlights and details. However, I have noticed sometimes with acrylics, especially when it comes to the highlights, I have to go over it again with another layer just to get that brightness out of it that I really want. Acrylics at times can be a little bit more dull, so I do want to just go over my highlights with that extra layer just to make sure I get that nice vibrancy. Okay, now I'm gonna clean up some of these darker colors, make sure that all my shadows are in place before I go into my darkest color yet. Because I had painted everything quite loosely, I just want to make sure that everything's covered up, all these little spaces and gaps that I left behind from when I blocked everything in. Okay, if you've stayed with me this whole time, thank you for your patience as we built up all this foundation and all these really great colors that I can now build on and add the contrast. And this is my favorite part about painting aspen trees, is when I start to add the darkest color, really building in all these tiny little details, filling in all these dark spots and lines and little tree cracks and little tiny dots and everything that goes into the characteristic look of an aspen tree. So this color is mostly Mars Black, tiny bit of titanium white, and raw umber and alizarin crimson, again, just sort of keeping with the theme of this sort of brownish, slightly reddish gray color. So I've got my round number 2 brush. It's got a nice sharp fine point on it for doing all these little details. And I'm kind of using the paint both somewhat thick and somewhat thin as a bit of a glaze depending on what I want to do. And that has to do with a lot of whether or not I want the paint to look transparent if I'm coming out of a shadow, or thick if I'm painting the deep parts of a shadow. This helps with showing a little bit of the paint underneath so that I get some of that color, and as well so some of that reddish color that's mixed in with this dark color will show through on top of these lighter grays. And as you can see by adding some of these dark colors right now, it's really starting to come to life, and just that high contrast is already starting to look really great. And the reason I do the darks last on these aspen trees is that I've found going the other way, dark to light, it's difficult to get these really fine lines and little spots by painting over them and following some of these contours and shapes. Here I'm able to put all these little details on top of this, allowing some of that lighter paint to shine through without having to go around any of these little lines or build up these light colors around the dark spots. This way those lines look nice and sharp, and they're very strong, and in the areas, especially on the tree bark, where it's this really almost hairline type of detail, I can get a nice, sharp, fine line. Alright, just continuing down the rest of the tree trunk with my dark color. And it's starting to look really good with this nice contrast. And I'm being really precise here, and I'm trying to use the nice, sharp, fine point of my brush to my advantage. I'm able to get nice thin lines, and I'm really able to dry brush over in spots where that needs to happen. This will give me that transparency that I'm going for. And as well, if I need to get it more opaque and a little bit darker, then I can just paint over it multiple times. And just trying to give each one of these spots and these little knots and marks their own kind of character and just their own uniqueness. And then onto the bottom part with this branch where there's a lot of detail and a lot of different things going on here, even with a little bit of that bark that's still hanging onto this dead branch. And in some of these parts, what I'm doing here is I'm using a little bit of a dry brush technique where I only get a small amount of paint that doesn't have a lot of water or moisture in it, and I just kind of use the brush to kind of slightly glaze over some of these details to give it that more transparent look. This can be really effective, especially on a branch like this, a branch that's a dead branch where you'd have a lot of that color variation and these dark spots that aren't completely dark, but you want to be able to see the colors below this paint through onto the top layer. And onto the branch that the robin is sitting on. And this one's going to have quite a bit of detail. There's a lot of little lines and cracks and the tree bark that's just kind of hanging on here. When I try and build a little bit of a gradient from the dark shadow underneath to the light with one single color, like this dark color, like I had said before, I'll start dark on the bottom and then kind of move up the tree branch with a little bit more of a transparent paint. And this will kind of help soften out that color and thin out that color so it's not so strong as it is on the bottom. I'm also being quite cautious here not to overdo it. I do a lot of these lines and little dots and it starts to look really good and feel really good, and so I'm tempted to do a lot more. But I just want to keep it within the confines of how my picture looks and how realistic it looks without really overdoing it. Then I'm just going to clean up the top edges of this bark, similar to the color that was the mid-range value on the tree trunk. And then I'm just going to add in a little bit of a brown color. Now this is where I bring in some of that cadmium red light to my mixture. And I just want to bring some color back into certain spots. I don't want to add too much, just a little bit here and there, very, very subtly. You can see it just kind of enhances some of these spots where there might be a little bit more than just this gray color. I can just subtly build up these tones just to give it a tiny bit of a tint. Alright, now for the final highlight, which is just titanium white, and I'm only going to put it just on the edge of the right side of the tree where the light is coming from. And on areas of these little ridges where the lines are, I'll maybe add a tiny bit just to emphasize that highlight. But I'm going to mostly keep it to the high ridges and the right side of the tree trunk to give it that nice strong sense of a direction of light. Okay, and down onto the bottom half of the tree. And you can see that I'm only just putting this bright white on just that leading edge on the right side of the tree. I think doing it just in this small amount really makes that sense of a direction of light really effective when it's just on that one side. And then of course just onto the highest ridges. And especially with the white, like I'd said before with the highlight colors, is that I have to sometimes go over it again, especially to really get that nice bright white look. As I had said before, sometimes the highlight colors do need that extra layer with acrylics just so that you get that vibrancy that you want out of these bright highlights. Then I'm going to darken this edge again. I felt like it wasn't dark enough. I really wanted there to be a bit more of a shadow there, so I'll just go back just on that left edge with kind of a darker brown. And I think deepening that shadow just a little bit really helped give it a little bit more of that three-dimensional shape where you have that nice bright highlight on the right side over to the dark shadow on the left side of the tree. And that has been the ultimate goal this entire time, is making this tree trunk, yes, look detailed, but mostly look round like it has three-dimensional shape. Okay, now I can move on to these background branches. And I'm not going to detail them too much like I had said before. I'm going to keep the contrast low, and this will help push them further back into the background. And now that the main tree trunk is done, it'll just give me a good idea of how dark I should make these details. So just go along and just add all the little knots and shadows. As well as the low contrast with these branches that helps push them back into the background. Not adding as much detail also kind of helps push them further back. This is a great way in a painting like this to push anything further back into the background, is to keep the contrast low and to keep the details lower than what you have in the foreground. And these smaller tree trunks that are on the left side of the painting here are going to be done in exactly the same way as I did the trunk in the foreground, except that I won't add my darkest darks like I did before. Again, keeping the contrast low so that they look a little bit further away. So the same idea here, but I'm painting even a bit more loosely than I did some of the parts of the foreground tree trunk. And I'm also going to try and keep the details a little bit softer on these ones. I don't want these to be the central focus of the painting, just something that kind of adds a little bit of depth into the piece. In the past, I've gotten a little bit carried away adding too many branches to a scene, and sometimes thinking that I need more in order to make it look real, like you're looking into a forest. But sometimes, in certain cases, and especially on a smaller painting like this, that having only a few branches kind of sticking out from the background really just adds the perfect balance to the scene. So just building up a little bit of those shadows, and even if there was a fair amount of all those little lines and cracks that we have on the foreground tree, I probably wouldn't put as many in this one just to keep the detail low, as I had said before. So again, just painting this very loosely. What I'm trying to do in this painting is just give a little bit of depth by separating these background branches and this tree trunk from the foreground. Then I can add the darkest color just to make some of these little spots and lines stand out. And you can see how much lighter this is than the darkest colors on the tree trunk in the foreground. So I am painting this background branch pretty quickly, and part of that is just having a little bit of a knowledge of sort of the general idea and shape of these aspen trees. Even though I am working from a photo, a picture that I took, I do think it's good in certain cases to know a little bit about how the tree generally is going to look, or even some of the shapes, just so that it looks as realistic as we need it to be for the painting and for the idea that we want to get across. So again, just the brightest highlight, going to use titanium white again for the highlight on this background tree. And then just the odd little touch of a color that's just slightly darker, just in a couple of spots. I felt like it needed that in just a few places here. Just going to kind of tidy up a few things, just kind of clean up a few edges, and I think that looks really great. Now the last thing I want to do is just add a bit of an orange color. For this orange color, I'm just going to start with my yellow oxide, tiny bit of this cadmium red light, tiny bit of raw umber, and then I'll just dull it down slightly with a little bit of white, a little bit of black. Maybe a bit more cadmium red light. Okay, that's good. And this is going to be for some of those little lichens and little mosses that are just kind of growing on some of these spots on the tree. I don't want to add too much of this, even though in my reference photo there's quite a bit. I'm going to try and build it up subtly to a point where I don't feel like it's overpowering the rest of the tree. Also, because the robin in this painting is going to be orange, I don't want there to be too much orange in other places, just enough to kind of bring a little bit of color harmony to the entire painting. And sometimes I find it's these small details, like just adding a little bit of this orange color to certain spots, just brings out such a great realistic look to the tree. Just add a few more spots. Make sure that everything looks really nice. A little bit on those background trees. And then I think this aspen tree is finished. I'm really happy with the way this tree turned out. I love the high contrast between the bark and the branches and the dark spots. It's the perfect setting for this robin to be perched on one of these branches. So thank you for joining me for the process of how I painted this aspen tree. Join me in the next video when I show you how I paint the robin. Thank you so much for watching.